This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/qualityculture. This is our very belated 100K special voted for by our subs. So to make it special, we both wrote and narrated this one. Thanks so much for watching, and special thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel. Japanese director Hayao Miyazaki is universally considered a master of his craft. For decades now, that goes without saying. What's equally interesting, at least to us, is the complicated identity rooted in the heart of these stories. Miyazaki's work is set apart by remarkable, mostly hand-drawn animation, rich subtext, and an underlying vibe that can best be described as wistful. He's retired 3 times but keeps returning, unable to resist the allure of creating beautiful things, yet all the while plagued by feelings of inadequacy. So he's developed a reputation as a perfectionist, workaholic, and grouchy old man. The more you inspect his musings and beliefs, the more you come to understand this is the art of a person in a decades-long feud with his own cynicism, trying to challenge or perhaps merely balance his misanthropy with sentiments of hope and compassion. Self-described as a bundle of contradictions, Miyazaki and his work pretty much convey what political philosopher Antonio Gramsci called pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Miyazaki often directly addresses this inner conflict, like in the afterword for Turning Point, the second collection of his interviews and writings over the years. So many thoughts concerning the world jostle inside my head. When I speak in public or write a piece, I try to narrow my topic and present it in a positive way without expressing my destructive negativity. But that's just one part of me. I'm a person whose negative aspects, brutality, resentment, hatred, are much stronger than other people's. When I suppress my negative aspects and live my life normally, I'm thought of as a good person. That is not my real character. I don't know what kind of person I really am. There seems to be another Hayao Miyazaki unfamiliar to me. I try not to care about this discrepancy anymore. To gain a better understanding of that discrepancy, we'll explore 6 common overarching threads in the 11 feature films he's directed: the themes, the context, and the intentions. And while we're focusing on Miyazaki in this video, he obviously wouldn't have gotten far without the teams of dedicated artists, composer Joe Hisaishi, producer Toshio Suzuki, or co-founder/friendly rival Isao Takahata. Speaking of, Studio Ghibli has produced plenty of other great films we may explore in later videos. For now, we're going to focus on how Miyazaki sees the world as it is, weaves that reality into his films, and ultimately chooses to depict things as they could be. We'll start with the most obvious recurring theme. As anyone who's watched more than 2 of Miyazaki's movies knows, love and respect for nature is generally his thing. There's some element of appreciation for the natural world in every film, regardless of the plot, but the subject is regularly at the forefront, along with direct or indirect criticism of humanity's environmental problem. What's most important to know about his views on this is even though he often depicts man versus nature in the classical sense, he rejects it as a natural dichotomy. Although humans are disconnected and estranged from nature, sentient and non-sentient, we can never truly be separate from it. We're animals living on Earth. We're still a part of nature and have to find harmony with it or perish. In the article Anime Landscapes as a Tool for Analyzing, the writers note that for Miyazaki, the destruction of nature and the destruction of the human soul are the same. In the paper, they describe how he presents human relationships to the environment in 3 ways, sometimes shifting or overlapping within a film: nature dominating humans, humans dominating nature, or equilibrium, humans as part of nature. Miyazaki illustrates the consequences of the 2 imbalance types and advocates for the 3rd relationship. Crucially, in these more eco-oriented films, nature's never just a pretty backdrop or passive entity, but like an integral character that even retaliates if threatened. He's basically saying we're not as in control as we think we are, and that nature has intrinsic value unrelated to what we can extract from it. With these outlooks in mind, he challenges our often anthropocentric view of the environment. And I think he most clearly confronted it in the 1984 film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, his second directing gig and first original story. Its success allowed him, along with Suzuki and Takahata, to open Studio Ghibli the following year. And its messaging made Miyazaki something of an environmentalist figure. While still a director for hire, he started the serialized manga for Nausicaa in 1982, and was later convinced to adapt it to animation. He didn't actually finish the 7-volume manga till 1994, so the film's plot is only covered in the first 2 volumes, its neatly tied-up ending was scrapped, and the resulting story is a lot more fleshed out and kind of wild. Please read it, it's some of Miyazaki's best work, and truer to his vision than the film was. Anyway, within the story, it's easy to spot inspiration from the sci-fi novels Dune and Earthsea: The Farthest Shore. This isn't the first time Miyazaki worked on a post-apocalyptic project either. The late 70s series Future Boy Conan was all about a kid navigating a landscape devastated by war. The same holds true for Nausicaa. 1,000 years ago, human weapons known as god warriors devastated the earth, and from the ruin arose the Sea of Decay, a deadly forest producing poisonous plants and fungi and lethal airborne spores.
5 minutes without a mask and I'd be dead.
Oh, and there are giant armored insects everywhere, and their swarms and deaths help spread the forest. But in the midst of this existential threat, human factions are still waging war against each other. Nausicaa's people live peacefully in a valley, protected from the forest's miasma by the ocean winds. But these dilemmas eventually collide in the valley, and she has to find a way to restore peace. Inspired by a 12th century Japanese folk tale, The Princess Who Loved Insects, Nausicaa had the unique skill to peacefully communicate with the insects, called the Om. She treats all creatures with compassion and even finds tranquil solitude within the Sea of Decay. Using insects stressed Miyazaki's message against anthropomorphism, i.e., giving human traits to non-humans to make them more relatable. Environmental scholar Ursula Heiss notes that animation is great for opening up a world being worked on by non-human agents in ways that resonate with environmentalist thought. All the more so if they're not simply presented as humans in another guise, but inhabit modes of thought and being all their own. The Om are as far from human as you can get, and are admittedly repulsive. And that's the point. Miyazaki thought reptiles and mammals are too familiar to humans. Regardless of how you switch up the design, they're still a collection of familiar parts. Using a visual combo of insects and arthropods makes creatures that are more unrecognizable and thus resist empathy, as he put it. He said because most people dislike bugs, they were the perfect creature to express a contrasting ecosystem. And he wasn't going to use butterflies either. He purposefully wanted them to be ugly, though I guess enormous butterflies would be just as terrifying. Bugs are also fitting for this story considering insect populations are in dramatic decline, and it's not as easy to advocate for beetles or wasps as it is for adorable pandas or majestic whales. But whether we like them or not, insects are vital in every terrestrial ecosystem.
We are not your enemies, we mean you no harm.
Nausicaa stresses that we can't just discard or destroy what we want out of convenience. Most media that depicts swarming or frightening insects will then celebrate their slaughter.
They came from another world to destroy the Earth.
Which makes sense when big insects are always the bad guy. Even Nausicaa's original English dub in 1986 cut 20 minutes of runtime and made the Om into purely aggressors, completely erasing the environmental message. And the weird poster that has nothing to do with the contents of the movie also suggests violence as the answer. But for Nausicaa, the Om aren't villains, just fellow creatures trying to live. And even the most recent Disney dub of the uncut film falters a bit when it comes to viewing other creatures as equals. In the article Miyazaki's Animism Abroad, it's pointed out how the nuances in the translations subtly remove respect to nature. For example, Mr. or Miss Wind is changed to simply the wind, and Nausicaa referring to a baby Omu as good child was translated to good boy, phrasing that's usually reserved for an obedient pet. Instead, the Om are more meant to represent the powerful unknown when it comes to the environment. Miyazaki said, the more we humans anthropomorphize something and make it an easy target for empathy, the less interesting it becomes. From the beginning, we seem to have a longing for a presence or a power that is far greater than ourselves and not easily understood. A presence beyond our current framework or whose origins are prehistoric. This longing isn't unique to me, but rather is what we all feel, a memory repeated over and over from our ancestors. Nature exists as an incredible force, as something huge, far exceeding our own little good or evil ways. So at the end of the film, instead of heading towards the human battle to fight with her people, Nausicaa diverts her path to rescue the tortured baby Omu and calm the raging herd. What's extra fascinating is her discovery earlier in the film, the true nature of the Sea of Decay. There were hints of it in Nausicaa's secret garden. The forest plants and their spores weren't poisonous if grown with clean soil and water. So the real problem with the world was polluted soil.
I don't understand who could have polluted the entire Earth.
Later on, after falling below the Sea of Decay into a non-toxic area, Nausicaa realized the forest had been purifying the soil. This idea of nature restoring itself was inspired by Minamata Bay. For years, methylmercury-filled wastewater from a chemical plant poisoned the water. People and animals who ate the contaminated fish suffered severe illness, now known as Minamata disease. Though the human tragedy here is obvious, especially since the government didn't step in for decades, Miyazaki was also interested in what happened to the fish. There's not a lot of info on mercury's effect on fish, though I did find one article that said exposure can produce varying toxic effects depending on the species. Miyazaki found it fascinating how the fish continue to thrive in the poisoned water, especially because people stopped fishing there. So he decided to explore this idea via the Sea of Decay, telling a story of nature bouncing back after human-caused pollution. Its ability to adapt and heal itself after devastation is what interested him. That above all, nature is flexible. And after all, as pointed out in the article The Toxic Heroine and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, toxicity is a relative concept. The Sea of Decay is only toxic from our human perspective. In reality, it's a life force and habitat for plenty of other species, and its spores give rise to new, non-human life. Plus, decay is also an overlooked factor in healthy ecosystems. As noted in an article about nature and Asian pluralism in Miyazaki's work, the movie affirms the essential role of microorganisms in decay in the cycle of life. The Sea of Decay in Nausicaa is not just a toxic wasteland, it's teeming with life forms, including insects and microbes, that are propelling a new phase of evolution. Decay, which appears to our ordinary human eyes as death and destruction, is actually a highly fertile and creative process at the microscopic level. The Sea of Decay epitomizes these two seemingly opposing but in reality completely intertwined forces of nature. What's easy to lose sight of, especially with Miyazaki's often gorgeous depictions of the natural world, is that he's also hoping to stress nature's intrinsic value that doesn't solely derive from our enjoyment or use, but that exists in and of itself, independent of humans. Sometimes that can come across as misanthropy, but in reality is just stressing the idea that humans aren't the center of the universe. In Miyazaki's words, this is why I think the solution to environmental issues must be to shift our perspective from preserving nature because it's useful to preserving it because it's not useful. We have to discard our old way of thinking, of judging something useful or not, and realize that everything is encompassed in nature, including things that aren't useful. The very end of Nausicaa leaves us with an optimistic image, a single seed growing underground, gleaming in a ray of sunlight. It suggests that environmental revival will be slow but not impossible, especially if we adapt along with the changing world. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is animism. Generally, animism is the belief that all natural things, animate and inanimate, possess a spiritual essence or soul. The concept is present in Nausicaa, but Miyazaki would explore it further in 1988's My Neighbor Totoro. My Neighbor Totoro was sparked by a shift in Miyazaki's opinion of Japan. He'd generally been pretty cynical about his country, which was perhaps reflected in the mostly European-inspired settings in his earlier work. But that all changed when he discovered the writings of ethnobotanist Sasuke Nakao, particularly the origins of cultivated plants in agriculture. In it, Nakao discussed the broadleaf evergreen forest culture hypothesis, the theory that in prehistoric times, broadleaf evergreen forest landscapes covered much of Asia and nurtured a common culture. This theory left a huge impression on Miyazaki and revitalized his way of thinking about Japan and its nature. As anime scholar and author of Miyazakiworld Susan Napier put it, liberated from what he saw as a narrow Japanese nationalism, Miyazaki felt that he could embrace the culture and beauty of his own country for the first time. Napier also points out this is why the dad in My Neighbor Totoro, an archaeologist, is studying Japan's Jomon period. In his plan for the film, Miyazaki writes that it's about what we have forgotten, what we don't notice, what we are convinced we have lost, and believing that we still have these things, I'm proposing to make My Neighbor Totoro. He went on to say it aims to be a happy and heartwarming film, a film that lets the audience go home with pleasant, glad feelings. Lovers will feel each other to be more precious, parents will fondly recall their childhoods, and children will start exploring the thickets behind shrines and climbing trees to find a Totoro. Most people would agree he accomplished this. Set in rural Japan, it follows sisters Mei and Satsuki after they move into a new home with their father, while their mother recovers from illness in a local hospital. They encounter spirits in the nearby forest, including the huge creature Totoro. There's not much of a plot. It mostly meanders around until the climactic scene where Totoro helps Satsuki find the lost Mei. That said, it has a really pleasant, soothing atmosphere, largely devoid of the stresses of modern life. It's often cited as taking place in the 50s, especially considering the doodles in Kanta's notebook which resemble Shigeru Sugita's manga art, but Miyazaki says it's actually set in a time before television. It seems he wanted to emphasize it's a setting with no tech distractions. It's like a memory of the post-war period when life seemed easier despite less material abundance, perhaps because communities felt more close-knit. There's a debate about whether any of the spirits like Totoro are even real within the story, including a handful of those dark fan theories where Mei and or Satsuki are actually dead at the end or whatever. Miyazaki hates these kinds of theories. As for whether the spirits are real, Napier feels that we never really know for sure adds to the pleasure of the encounter. Traditionally, East Asian philosophy and thought has been far more comfortable than the West with the sense of the betwixt and between.
We'd like to share your roof for a while, sir, if you don't mind.
And within this in-between lies the elements of Shintoism present in the story, a belief system that's deeply tied to animism and connection to the land. Shintoism is usually referred to as a native Japanese religion, though it's more of an unstructured, decentralized belief system, more about ritual and tradition than aligning with a rigid dogma. Miyazaki stresses he's not religious, and purposefully tries to avoid overt religious symbolism. Still, you can catch glimpses of religious iconography here and there, like Tori, Buddhist statues, the fox god Inari. More significantly, kami are all over the place, including Totoro and his friends. Kami are deities and spirits inhabiting the natural world, both animate and inanimate, organic and inorganic, including phenomena like weather and natural disasters. So the concept of kami is pretty aligned with what animism describes, including the idea that such spirits warrant deep reverence and respect.
Please continue to look after us.
Totoro, his small companions, the soot spirits in the girl's new house, and even the giant camphor tree which has a Shinto rope tied around it can be thought of as kami. They all suggest an otherworldly presence and a deep connection to nature. And it's emphasized by Miyazaki's recurring choice to place sacred areas in dark, kind of eerie locations. He notes that the West associates darkness with bad and light with good, but says that for Japanese people, the gods often reside in the darkness, like deep in the forest or mountains and overgrown, creepy, isolated areas where the silence is profound. He applies this concept in the underground realm of Nausicaa, the ancient submerged city in Laputa, and the center of the city where the giant crystal resides, the woods in The Wind Rises where lovers find one another again, the healing pond in Princess Mononoke where the great forest spirit roams, and of course the forest where we find Totoro. It all evokes a disorienting sense of uncertainty and awe, but still offers a kind of comfort, which was Miyazaki's main goal with this film. It's worth noting the particular state of affairs the film arose from. As noted in the article, The Healing of Nature, The Nature of Healing, in order to go one step beyond nostalgia and a longing for utopian harmony with nature, My Neighbor Totoro should be seen with its historical context taken into account. The popularity of the film symptomatically reveals the bleakness of modern human life with its estrangement from the gifts of nature, thereby making us aware that the peaceful rural life presented in the film is in fact under threat of disappearance. Totoro was released in 1988, in the midst of Japan's economic bubble. It was an extravagant period marked by materialism and hyper-commercialism, but at its tipping point, especially when the bubble soon burst, people started questioning their modern values. According to scholar Tatsuya Yumiyama, this led to the healing fad in the 90s. Now in a spiritual vacuum, Japanese people started longing for what they lost in their chase for modernity. My Neighbor Totoro and media like it seemed to be a balm for people who didn't have access to the kind of nature and simpler lifestyle depicted in it. Miyazaki was disgusted with the excess and materialism in the bubble period, asserting the Japanese were not able to transcend the demon of rapid economic development, and as a result, we have the corruption of the world, the loss of ideals, and the worship of material things. But he found himself in a dilemma, placing blame on himself for creating more products to consume, contributing to what he calls a mass consumption civilization. For a long time, he's felt that the animation industry and media in general has also become subject to this framework of consumption, that even art, no matter its level of sincerity, is forced to fit within a scheme of commercialized reality. And so he condemns the quality of the animation being churned out by the industry, feeling that most of it is only adding to cultural pollution and comes from a place of not understanding or acknowledging real human beings. You may have seen the meme where he says anime was a mistake, and while he didn't technically say this, he might as well have. Take this quote from 1979. The animator himself feels a certain level of self-satisfaction, and in accepting this situation, has submitted to the trivialization of his creative spirit. You may have become an animator because you wanted to build your own fictional world, but such romantic dreams are quickly destroyed. Who could reproach you for mechanically running your pencil across the paper as you sit at the conveyor belt, confronting the incredibly large pile of work to be done, the totally inadequate production budget and time schedule, the stupidity of the broadcaster or sponsor or promoter, and the formidable barrier of the pre-existing specialization system? There's no shortage of rationalizations. It's easy to be a cog once you get used to it.
会社っていうのはね、金の流れだけで決まっていくから。それでジブリが魅力がなくなったらさっさとやめた方がいいです。僕も真っ先にやりますから。
His dreams come with a conflicting reality. He thinks kids spend too much time at home raised on virtual reality, and that his work only contributes to that.
子供たちが現実を知る時間をアニメーションが代わりに奪ってるんだと僕は思ってます。
And he's mortified when parents tell him their kids watch his movies over and over again. Instead, he was hoping films like My Neighbor Totoro would encourage children to explore their surroundings. So again, it's a return to what we've lost, emphasizing that the powers of nature and experiencing the world around us, including socializing with our communities, helps our minds and hearts heal. In regards to the ending, Napier cites Kaplan and Wong. Modernity has shattered the inherited ground of experience, and the intimate cultural networks of support and trust that humans hitherto relied on for a sense of security and meaningful life. Totoro offers a possibility of the recovery of these intimate cultural networks through both fantasy and its vision of collective human decency. Landscapes and communities like this are disappearing, and Miyazaki understands that large-scale problems like deforestation, pollution, and climate change often feel too complicated to even think about, let alone make an effort to combat it. In the face of that sense of powerlessness, he feels people should focus their attention on local efforts. His reason being, if we're mainly confining ourselves to big-picture, general statements about things, there's simply too much beyond our control. So he's more for an on-the-ground approach, where details and specifics can be worked with realistically. My Neighbor Totoro has inspired various conservation efforts across Japan and even abroad, and we're going to talk about the film a bit more later on. Its laid-back, healing tone helped reinvigorate people's sense of appreciation for the natural world, but Miyazaki's approach to environmental stories soon changed. Like I mentioned, Japan's economic bubble collapsed in 1991 due to the deteriorating economy, dubbed Japan's lost decade, as well as international political conflicts we'll talk more about later. Miyazaki felt he couldn't make another upbeat, laid-back film like Totoro or Kiki's Delivery Service, stating he didn't want to pretend to children that we're happy. He was also sick of the branding that Ghibli mostly made gentle nature films and wanted to break away from that label, feeling that if they only showed nature's delights and elegance, they'd be a false advertiser for environmentalism. Somehow, the post-apocalyptic film with massive bugs, a growing deadly jungle, and a giant monster weapon ended on a somewhat more hopeful note than 1997's Princess Mononoke would. Now more than ever, Miyazaki's trying to emphasize how dysfunctional, traumatizing, and exploitative our relationship to nature really is. It follows the young prince Ashitaka as he saves his village from a demon but gets fatally cursed in the process. He was then exiled, set off in search of a cure, and ended up mediating conflict between an ironworks town and the nearby wolf gods, including their adopted human San. In the pursuit of expansion and mineral resources, the town, which employs and houses various outcasts under the leadership of Lady Eboshi, was cutting down the forest, and its spirits started retaliating. The cursed boar god Ashitaka killed earlier was a result of this ongoing feud. Miyazaki describes this film as a period drama woven from two threads: a vertical thread of a struggle between humans and spirits, and a horizontal thread between a girl and a boy. This meeting is the key to their liberation. Although it's set in the Muromachi period, Miyazaki took care to avoid common tropes and conventions associated with the time period. He loves Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, but felt it casts a spell on those who make period dramas. That the depiction of this social structure appealed to audiences in the post-war period, but it's not very accurate to most of the actual experiences of the time. This take is largely influenced by the writings of historian Yoshihiko Amino, whose studies focused on people often neglected in conventional research, like women, artisans, craftsmen, and outcasts. Plus, Miyazaki thought the samurai thing was boring and overdone at that point. He really downplayed the importance of the emperor and samurai in Princess Mononoke. They're pretty much afterthoughts and are far from noble and sacred.
From the emperor himself?
That's nice. Who's
Is he supposed to be important?
And they get their limbs and heads severed off pretty unceremoniously. Instead, Miyazaki focused on more outcast populations of the time, and of course a bunch of forest gods. The story's set in the Muromachi period specifically because it's seen as a transitional period in Japanese history, in terms of the way people interacted with the environment. According to Napier, in Miyazaki's view, the 14th century is a period of significant historical transition from a world that was still in close contact with both natural and supernatural forces to a world that would become increasingly oriented toward the human. As he says, it was in this period that people changed their value system from goods to money. Apparently, the new view started taking hold where people felt they could control nature rather than worship or revere it. Even though ironworks facilities and communities like this didn't really exist to this scale, and women certainly weren't working in them, the industry was already a major contributor to the deterioration of ecosystems. And Miyazaki would give literal voices to the victims of that destruction and unchecked development, by imagining what it would be like if nature could retaliate against our efforts to destroy it, this time in a pretty horrifying way.
Suffer as I have suffered.
Perhaps the most jarring aspect of Princess Mononoke is the brutal violence. Again, he was trying to steer away from the notion that nature is harmless, peaceful, and under our thumb. Based on the island of Yakushima in southern Japan, he wanted the forest to express an ambiance of mysteriousness and the feeling that something is watching. Even the cute Kodama, the tree spirits, are a little bit creepy. He used silence and darkness again to create stillness and an eerie atmosphere. Apparently Miramax, the US distributor for the film, owned by Disney at the time, wanted to add sound effects in some spots because it was too quiet for American audiences. Like they wanted to add a twinkling noise for butterflies or the sound of a cloud passing, which, you know, aren't real sounds. Ghibli obviously said no to that, and to cutting the film by half an hour, haunted by the memory of what happened with Nausicaa. Here, the kami are a bit more personified than in previous films.
Disgusting little creatures.
And they're pissed off. The name Princess Mononoke is actually an insult directed at San. Mononoke in Japanese folklore are elusive, often vengeful spirits. So the townspeople are degrading the kami, and by extension San, by essentially calling them monsters or angry ghosts. The indifferent great forest spirit almost does feel like a ghost. Also called Shishigami and Nightwalker, it's an unfathomable, unsettling, and strange presence, whether in ectoplasmic form or not. This only emphasizes Miyazaki's stance against anthropocentrism and even anthropomorphism. Napier writes, rendering the Shishigami in all its simultaneous beauty and grotesqueness, Miyazaki takes the film squarely in an ethical direction that goes beyond the truism of humans dominating nature. In this regard, the film contrasts with Disney films in which even enthusiasts acknowledge a cutification of nature occurs. In his analysis of Bambi, for example, Disney scholar David Whitley acknowledges the movie's sentimentalizing of nature, noting that the choreographed interactions between animal friends or different species, the wide-eyed enhancement of facial features designed to appeal to human ideals of attractiveness, and the elimination of natural predators to create a world of idyllic innocence all combine to create a sentimental viewpoint that is difficult to reconcile with full respect for the integrity and otherness of the natural world. The Shishigami is both terrifying and beautiful, just like the joyous Kodama who look on in wonder and anticipation. As the hunters illustrate, it's an otherworldly experience that makes you feel as though you're looking at something you shouldn't be looking at, something sacred outside the realm of human thought or understanding.
But sir, we can't. It's a sin to look at it.
In effect, we get the message that humans don't dominate this space, or even the world. In promotional material for a short film a few years later, Miyazaki wrote, "I am much more attracted to the idea of preserving the forests, not for the sake of humans, but because they themselves are alive." At the same time, there's an overarching message of harmony and vitality, and of seeing the world with eyes unclouded. Ashitaka was part of the Amishi people, a real ethnic group that was displaced and driven to the north due to Japanese imperialism. Their culture had pretty much disappeared by the Muromachi period, so it seems Ashitaka represents the last remnants of their people. This is why his identity and unusual clothing were often called into question. But because of his elevated outsider status, more outsidery than anyone else here, he was more equipped to offer a third-party perspective.
There's a demon inside of you. It's inside both of you.
In this frame of mind, he rejected viewing the situation with a hateful or vengeful heart, especially since he'd be dead soon anyway. What he saw from his unclouded point of view were two groups both battling in desperation for survival. It's a realistic outlook on what many conflicts truly are. They're rarely about good and evil and more about opposing interests or perspectives. Miyazaki said in an interview, "It would be so easy to create a scheme that depicts humans as inane, with bad people cutting trees down and good people protecting the trees. But that would be entirely unrelated to the essence of human beings. It's more likely that those people who were hardworking and kind to their neighbors were the same ones who, in an effort to improve living conditions, carved up the mountains and dispersed the animals. It's not enough to go around saying that we have to respect nature, that we should always live a pure and proper life in nature. If that's the case, what should today's people who have to live in cities do? Aren't their lives of value too? Well, I certainly think they are." What some call eco-cinema is getting more and more popular for kids, but the approach is often melodramatic, pitting heroic nature against evil humanity. Things are seldom that black and white, and this approach tends to create a passive audience that doesn't have to think about anything beyond, "I hope the bad guys lose." With Princess Mononoke, we're instead left conflicted, since the townspeople's motivations are at least somewhat understandable. It's posited in the article Princess Mononoke and Beyond, New Nature Narratives for Children, that the film stands out as an alternative to the dominant mode that relies on melodrama spectacle, moral polarity, and narrative conclusiveness. This lack of clear-cut conclusion leads to a pretty bittersweet ending. After the Shishigami is decapitated and its deadly ooze spreads upon the land, Ashitaka and San return its head, but it dies anyway, leaving behind a green landscape. Ashitaka wants San to be with him, but it seems the issue isn't quite resolved.
Ashitaka, you mean so much to me, but I can't forgive the humans for what they've done.
彼らはその後ずっと良い関係を続けるだろうと思います。それからサンが生きていくためにアシタカはいろいろな努力をするだろうと。同時にタタラバの人々が生きていくためにも大変な努力を払うだろう。そのためにアシタカは引き裂かれて傷だらけになるだろうと思いますが、それでも彼はそれを曲げずに生きていこうと思って両方を大切にしようと思い続けるだろう。
We've heard the cries of despair after ecological destruction, but what now? Where do we go from here? We have to make sacrifices if we want to preserve the environment, especially because if we destroy nature, we'll destroy ourselves in the process. Again, there's no simple solution, but the interdependence of nature and humanity still isn't fully recognized by most people. Unlike Shinto beliefs, which maintain we're at the mercy of these gods, we still think we have power over nature instead of the other way around. Yet as the years go on, we're being proved wrong time and again. As illustrated in Nausicaa, nature has grown and evolved and adapted over millions of years. Human activity will cause the Earth to lose biodiversity, and ecosystems will have to acclimate and turn the tide. But the Earth will keep spinning. Creatures will either adapt to the instability or go extinct and give way to other species that can. Fish will go on swimming in Minamata Bay. Nature itself, that ever-changing, ever-evolving concept, that is not in danger. But humans are. In 2008, Studio Ghibli released Ponyo, a cute story inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, in which a goldfish who lives with her father and dozens of sisters meets a boy, escapes her home, and with her father's magic inadvertently makes herself human like she wanted, and unleashes a massive tsunami on the small coastal town, bringing back ancient animals from the late Devonian period in the process. The setting's based on the seaside town Tomonura. While much of the film is rather cutesy and largely dedicated to children exploring their surroundings, a lot like Totoro, Miyazaki said he couldn't make it too simple and innocent like he did back then. He wanted to add an extra layer to the premise. So one can't ignore the intensity of Ponyo's setting considering the real-life extreme weather and natural disasters that are becoming more of a regular, almost expected occurrence. The disastrous flooding feels genuinely alarming. It's clear the ocean wasn't just some interesting or pretty scenery, but something integral to communicate the idea of transformation and lack of control. In his intent for the project, Miyazaki wrote that the sea below, like our subconscious mind, intersects with the wave-tossed surface above. By distorting normal space and contorting normal shapes, the sea is animated not as a backdrop to the story, but as one of its principal characters. With no straight lines, it becomes a world where even the horizon swells, dips, and sways. We witness disaster through the eyes of children, their wonderment at the transformed environment, and also their distress. But while we accompany them, the journey is mostly serene, almost disturbingly so, given their surroundings.
I was once long ago a human myself. I had to leave that all behind to search preserve the Earth.
Meanwhile, Ponyo's father Fujimoto has been compared to Miyazaki himself.
Humans are disgusting!
Apparently, he used to be human but chose to leave humanity behind, disgusted and resentful because of their pollution, and musing about their eventual demise.
An end to the era of those abominable humans.
The ending is simplistic and upbeat. Sosuke accepts Ponyo for who she is, girl or fish, and she willfully transforms into a human and they live happily ever after. The art is stunning, though despite the added thematic layer, it's probably one of Miyazaki's less complex films, and he somewhat acknowledges its limitations. Quote, "Due to the power of Sosuke's heart, a new balance is attained and the world calms down. The film ends with instability and concern for the future, but that is the fate of the human race beyond the 21st century, a topic that can't be settled in one film. If Ponyo accomplishes anything, it definitely adds to the recurring apocalyptic visions of environmental disaster in Miyazaki's work. The floodwaters destroy towns, the fish are back, we are the virus, etc. It's another argument against anthropocentrism, trying to rid humans of the illusion that we're somehow in control.
An earthquake so strong it literally shifted the Earth's axis by about 25 centimeters.
In 2011, a couple years after Ponyo was released, a magnitude 9 earthquake jostled Japan's infrastructure and created a massive tsunami that absolutely devastated the northeastern coastline. It also caused a level 7 nuclear accident in Fukushima, joining only Chernobyl in that category, as the plant's meltdowns and explosions led to the release of radiation in the atmosphere. Thousands died and many more were left homeless, and it still remains the costliest natural disaster. Later that year, in a popular Japanese TV channel's annual marathon of Ghibli films, they removed Ponyo from the lineup. Miyazaki has stated, "We try to conserve nature because it yields a nature useful to us as a species, but nature is essentially savage. It negates culture and civilization. Despite humans' efforts to improve things for themselves, nature contains elements flatly opposed to our efforts." With that, I'll quickly discuss Laputa Castle in the Sky because this section is already way too long. Let's go back in time to Miyazaki's third film in 1986. It centers on an orphan girl Shida with a magic crystal, who people keep trying to kidnap so they can find the lost flying island of Laputa, Shida's original home, which Miyazaki named after Jonathan Swift's Flying Island in Gulliver's Travels. She's helped by her new friend Patsu and later a band of flying pirates. She and Patsu eventually make it to the abandoned island, but military forces soon arrive, led by the power-hungry Nausicaa, who's one of Miyazaki's only outright villains. He wants to use Laputa's weapons technology to conquer the world. It's a device that's described to be responsible for disasters in the Bible and Ramayana, and its power calls to mind the atomic bombings in Japan. As Patsu and Shida explored the island, they discovered that the robots there are actually caretakers of the animals and the landscape, when not faced with hostile threats like we saw earlier in the film. Nausicaa's character shows that nature is often an obstacle to us, something to remove and exterminate out of convenience.
Horrible things, I'll have them burned.
He's disgusted by the overgrowth in the center of the city and plans to get rid of it.
These filthy roots don't belong in this chamber.
Yet the entire city itself is built surrounding an enormous tree, its true life force. Miyazaki presents the surprising notion that technology and modernity can coexist with nature, if only we didn't use it for destructive purposes. In the article The City Ascends, Laputa as Critical Ecotopia, it's remarked that the very image of such a place is shocking within American environmentalism and its uncritical utopianism and dystopianism. Furthermore, a guardian robot who saves birds' nests and tends the abundant garden of the future is anathema to both poles of the argument. Technological utopians still consider nature to be the foil, not the companion of artificial intelligence. Much of the discourse of climate change is still infected with the idea of the planet as object of control. The idea that a robot could be a better friend to the Laputan environment is a contradiction in terms. Technology is what separates humans from communion with the wild, what makes us more unnatural and unethical. Miyazaki questions the assumption that technology is imperialist by nature. Through the island of Laputa, the film showcases harmony between modernity and nature, but only if we shed the impulse towards power and warfare. When Shida and Patsu recite the spell of destruction via the crystal, the weapon alone was shed from Laputa. The city, despite its technology, is more than just a force for destruction, but then it flies away uninhabited, a utopia that doesn't yet belong to us. Again, these two seemingly opposite lifestyles can coexist and should. Technology alone won't be enough to solve our problems. We still need to protect nature if we want a healthy balance and a relatively safer world. From the aforementioned article, it's pointed out that the notion that environmental problems can be solved through technological innovation has been remarkably persistent. In this sense, technological utopianism has deep roots in American environmentalism, and the fetishized nature of media attention to the next electric car, the compact fluorescent light bulb, or atmospheric engineering to counter global warming underlines the persistence of this way of thinking. Laputa insists that the fault lies not in our technology, but in ourselves. Real environmental progress requires cultural change, which is generally harder to engineer than a light bulb. While Nausicaa gave us a somewhat hopeful ending, this film questions whether we even deserve an ecotopia like Laputa. The central conflict stresses that cultural change will probably have to come with renunciation of warfare. Throughout most of these films, Miyazaki depicts war, often human-to-human conflict, as a major obstacle hindering our ability to care for the environment.
Miyazaki was born in Tokyo in the midst of World War II. Some of his earliest memories are of bombed cities. His family had to evacuate at least twice to avoid air raids. Meanwhile, his father's company manufactured parts for fighter planes, a fact Miyazaki clung to with resentment and guilt for decades. In college, he earned a degree in political science and economics and has been an outspoken pacifist ever since, clearly deeply troubled by his early experiences and family history. He once said, "I'm fascinated by wars, and I read a lot about them. People therefore often ask me, Miyazaki-san, do you like war?" And I respond by asking if they think AIDS researchers like AIDS. So on that note, let's talk about Porco Rosso. It's probably the most adult-oriented film Miyazaki's directed, having described it as a cartoon movie for tired, middle-aged men whose brain cells have turned to tofu. Originating as a manga and model graphics magazine, the story got commissioned as a short, in-flight entertainment film, which was later expanded to full length. The 1992 film follows an Italian bounty hunter, Marco, who takes down sky pirates for a living. He was a fighter pilot in World War I, but has since fled the country and hides away on islands in the Adriatic Sea. Oh, and he was mysteriously cursed with a pig's head right before the war ended.
Buying some patriotic bonds to help serve our nation.
Sorry, I'm a pig.
Unsurprisingly, Miyazaki's messaging is explicitly anti-fascist. Not only has Marco fled the line of duty, but he's hyper-aware and outspoken about the dangers of nationalism.
Thanks for the offer, but I'd rather be a pig than a fascist.
His American rival Curtis, who challenges him to a dogfight for the movie's climactic scene, is an annoying caricature, but he's not the main antagonist. That's made clear by the end when they both have to flee from the Italian Air Force. The real villain here is fascism, and war is this looming reality, always present in the background, encroaching on the narrative. While the film has a similar vibe to Casablanca, including the nightclub, the unattainable lover,
sorry baby, gotta fly,
you jerk!
and the protagonist's cynicism and reluctance to get involved in war or politics.
Easy, kid. I'm just a bounty hunter. I'm not fighting a war.
Casablanca eventually shifts its stance. Just like the US eventually gave up on neutrality during World War II, Rick's sympathies for the Allies grew, and he took action. Meanwhile, it seems Porco Rosso presses for not just anti-fascism, but all-out anti-war pacifism. Marco never stops running away. At one point, he recalls the memory of a brutal dogfight, after which thousands of pilots ascended into the sky, their shimmering planes disappearing into the horizon, leaving him behind. He begs his newly married best friend to trade places with him.
What about Gina? You can't leave her alone. Let me go instead.
It's a haunting scene that captures the horrific consequences of war. It's inspired by Roald Dahl's short story, They Shall Not Grow Old, in which a World War II RAF pilot named Finn recounts a similar story to Marco's, where he witnessed other planes of every description, flying together and landing on a green plane, heading towards a bright white light. Finn yearned to join them in death, but fate had other plans. Marco's experience isn't too out of the blue given the number of pilots and planes from both sides that never returned home. But even though he's explicitly anti-fascist, he's arguably maybe too much of a passive bystander, and his reticence seems to be explained by this tragic memory. He's withdrawn from society because of the post-traumatic stress inflicted by the experience. The curse is a physical manifestation of survivor's guilt, and feeling he could have done more to help his friends.
Good guys were the ones who died, or maybe I'm dead and life as a pig is the same thing as hell.
He still carries the weight of what he experienced on his shoulders, and feels pressured to continue life alone. Due to Japan's role in World War II, Miyazaki also carries a form of guilt, especially considering that his family's financial security derived from warfare, so he's deeply angry and ashamed for both personal and national reasons. He said, "When it comes to guilt, It's a consistent theme inside me. My family in Japan, my household, and then Japan in the world, Japan in Asia. This guilt coils around my memories, and if I lose that guilt, then somehow I have the feeling that I'll lose the most important thing about myself. I even feel that the guilt is what really supports me. Pigs make frequent appearances in his work, often associated with some kind of curse. Marco is no different. His pig face represents how these traumatic wartime experiences alienate veterans from other people when they return home. In the article, When Pigs Fly, Anime, Auteurism, and Miyazaki's Porco Rosso, it's noted that a thorny issue for Japanese culture is how to make sense of the legacy of fascism. How could otherwise decent people have let such a system take over? How could younger generations assimilate that into their cultural narratives? By setting a story in Italy on the verge of fascism, Miyazaki gets to explore some of these moral and ethical issues indirectly, suggesting that one reason fascism might have been able to take over was due to, quote, good guys like Porco becoming lost in cynical self-indulgence and refusing to take a stand against it. And while it is crucial to critique the negative aspects of pressure to a social conformity, if people completely turn their backs on society, all they have left is Marco's cynical pigdom. The ending leaves a bit of mystery as to whether his curse was lifted, though the empty garden implies he did get together with Gina, says she's no longer waiting for him there. Yet, throughout the film, we're aware of the even worse war that's to come, and it creates a sense of bittersweetness. While Miyazaki worked on Porco Rosso, he said ongoing political conflicts caused it to become a, quote, more complicated film. His post-war generation had been more optimistic about the possibility of a better world, since they witnessed their battered country grow from the wreckage and progress for the better. According to him, there was a sense of hope for the future. But in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Yugoslav wars erupted, and the Japanese government contributed billions in financial aid for the Gulf War as Japan's economic bubble burst. Miyazaki said he was, quote, dumbfounded, running around in a haze. Fast forward to 2003, when he won an Oscar for Spirited Away and refused to attend the ceremony in protest of the Iraq War, saying, I had thought that, thanks to us having lost the war, we Japanese might have finally become a little more skeptical about national claims of righteousness and just causes. Watching Bush, I can only think he's possessed by the ghost of John Wayne, telling him that this is the way a real man should act. Saddam Hussein's sense of righteousness is the same. This sentiment directly inspired and permeated his next film, 2004's Howl's Moving Castle. He said he purposefully wanted to make a film that would be poorly received in the US. Based on a 1986 fantasy novel by Diana Wynne Jones, it tells the story of a young woman named Sophie who's cursed with an aging spell by a vindictive witch. Sophie seeks out the wizard Howl to help her reverse the spell and moves into his castle with his fire demon Calcifer and his young apprentice. Unlike the book, which is more ingrained in the classic fairy tale genre, Miyazaki makes war a more central part of the narrative. It apparently started because a prince was kidnapped, but we mostly see the war from a distance. It seems this is how Miyazaki avoided glorifying it and making it into a grand spectacle. We don't see big military battles or combat. All we see are the civilians on the ground, victims of indiscriminate slaughter, people that have little to nothing to do with the decisions of their governments and militaries. The bombings are likely similar to what Miyazaki and his family experienced in World War II. The real essence of the anti-war aspect is Hal's burning hatred.
Is it the enemies or one of ours?
What difference does it make? Those stupid murderers.
He's a character no doubt infused with Miyazaki's own anger and bitterness. At first, he avoided the war entirely, ignoring the mandatory summons to fight for the kingdom. His rebellion goes against what Miyazaki describes as the, quote, loyalty of boys, which he feels is a syndrome that gives birth to tragedy, as nations and extremist groups force or convince young men to fight in needless wars or exercises of power, exploiting their loyalty only to treat them as disposable. Meanwhile, Madame Suliman, the king's sorceress and Hal's former mentor, seems more concerned with pursuing conflict than helping her country's citizens. She represents Miyazaki's view that these issues are usually perpetrated by the callous and fickle nature of the people in power, and that despite this, people often blindly root for the questionable actions of the militaries and leaders. Later on, it's like Hal's fighting the concept of war itself, but the anger starts to consume him, just as it consumed the other wizards who signed on to fight. He started morphing into what he hated, indicated by his cursed bird-like form, and Calcifer warns him that he may not be able to turn back.
You shouldn't keep flying around like that. Soon you won't be able to turn back into a human.
It illustrates how war can wreck a person, not just physically, but psychologically. How it can warp our perceptions of what the right thing even is, and how even a pacifist can become blinded by mindless rage against perceived enemies. No matter the reason or circumstance, war has the potential to turn people into monsters.
The bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned.
Miyazaki stresses that, quote, "It would be false to say that because we're on the side of justice, we can go ahead and destroy our opponents and the world will be at peace. That, at least, I could say would be a total lie. Now I know that there are such things as good and evil in the world, and that people do good things. But people who do good things are not necessarily good people. They just happen to be people who have done good things. The next instant they might wind up doing something bad, and if we don't take that into account in our view of humans, we'll constantly make mistakes when making political decisions, or decisions about ourselves." Miyazaki's approach to anti-war stories brings to mind the author Kurt Vonnegut, a World War II vet who once wrote, "I have told my sons that they are not under any circumstances to take part in massacres, and that the news of massacres of enemies is not to fill them with satisfaction or glee." Like Miyazaki usually, Vonnegut doesn't have villains in his stories. In 1983, Miyazaki said he wanted to create a version of Beauty and the Beast where the character is cleansed by being devoted to something, and is transformed by being cleansed, so that at the end, the character becomes what we wish had been there all along. It seems he carried this out with Howl's character. In the end, Howl recognizes his appreciation and devotion for his found family, and goes on to cherish them peacefully. The kidnapped prince was actually the scarecrow Sophie had been helping. She breaks the spell, and the powers that be end the war pretty abruptly. In an article on Counteract, it's pointed out that this futility and pointlessness is emphasized at the film's conclusion, when the conflict is ended in a manner that's both flippant and arbitrary. The frivolous manner in which the hostilities are brought to a conclusion raises the question as to whether this is an ending at all. If this war can be concluded so quickly, surely another could be started just as easily, but this is perhaps the point. Sure enough, at the very end, we see bombers heading to another war, off to repeat the cycle again. Almost as ubiquitous as environmental themes, nearly all of Miyazaki's films contain some kind of flight sequence.
もう上から見てみると本当に全部むき出しにいろんなものが見えるんですよ。こう遥か向こうまで行けそうな気がするよね。行けんじゃないかな。
Regarding this, he said, "I have a strong desire to be liberated from being tied down to reality. When forced to explain it, I could say that's my rationale. That's why I want to fly away. A moving perspective that incorporates a sense of space in the picture, that creates a sense of liberation, and that makes our souls want to greet the wind, the clouds, and the beautiful earth we see unfolding far below. These are the wonderful scenes and machines I dream of someday depicting." His admiration for aircraft obviously goes hand in hand with his love of flight. There's all kinds of them in his films, with varying designs and shapes and sizes and mechanisms. It's not hard to tell he's an aviation enthusiast. His most recent film, 2013's The Wind Rises, was the most plane-centric one yet.
Airplanes are not tools for war. Airplanes are beautiful dreams.
It's very loosely biographical, based on the real engineer Jiro Horikoshi, who designed the Mitsubishi Zero used by Japan in World War II. The movie follows his journey in the industry designing airplanes for the military, as well as a romantic relationship, though that part is mostly fictionalized, inspired by Tatsuo Hori's novel The Wind Has Risen. It's a beautiful, haunting film that illustrates the disconnect between innovators and the ways their creations are used. At one point, it depicts the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake that Miyazaki's grandfather actually survived, eerily paralleling Japan's 2011 earthquake along with the rise in nationalism that came from it. It's clearly a much more personal film for Miyazaki, and made him more emotional than all the others. But it was also his most controversial and was condemned by both sides of the political spectrum. According to liberals and leftists, since Miyazaki didn't explicitly depict the negative repercussions of Jiro's creations and mostly honed in on the creative and technological brilliance, he was accused of evading the atrocities of Japan's war crimes and glorifying its weapons.
That's a zero.
The assembly of the Zeros involved Korean slave laborers, and they were of course then used to kill thousands of people, including via infamous kamikaze missions.
As Japan carved out its South Pacific Empire, the Zero ran rampant.
People felt that by turning away from the reality of these effects, Miyazaki was ignoring the responsibility of the death and destruction brought about by the Zero, that he was focusing too much on the personal fulfillment of one man, and not enough on the global consequences of that man's actions. Many critics and fans alike called the film distasteful, out of touch, and even morally repugnant. Even Susan Napier alludes to its faults. In this film, Miyazaki creates a new kind of fantasy, a history that stops just before the darker side of technological development appears. Yet this fantasy is historically grounded and, as such, is no longer quite so arm's length. That the Zeros were magnificent technological achievements that brought death to tens of thousands is more than an inconvenient truth.
In our kingdom of dreams, now it's the land of the dead.
Meanwhile, a pacifistic essay he penned for a special issue of Ghibli's magazine drew criticism from Japanese right-wing nationalists. He objected to the Prime Minister's plan to amend the constitution to allow for more militarism, and reiterated that Japan hasn't apologized enough for the war crimes committed in World War II. For this, Miyazaki was called a traitor, and his film was deemed anti-Japanese propaganda. So on one hand, he was criticized for being anti-military and anti-Japanese, and on the other, not critical enough of Japan's role in the war. Regardless, this evasion of war in the narrative is a little bizarre for him. He once said he wants to avoid drawing aircraft in a way that, quote, further feeds an infatuation with power. Yet, as someone who hates war, he celebrates the beauty of its technology. His longtime producer Suzuki encouraged him to make this film precisely because of those contradicting ideals.
要するに自分の好きなものが引き裂かれてるんですよ。一方で戦争の兵器でしょ。
Miyazaki seems to be attempting to reconcile some of those contradictions within himself. Jiro felt he had no options in a world where invention and technology inevitably fell in the hands of those who'd abuse it. But at the same time, German engineer Hugo Junkers, one of Jiro's heroes, died under house arrest trying to keep his technology out of Nazi hands. Jiro, on the other hand, continued to contribute to war efforts by designing planes. And even though it was only mildly addressed, the reality of that dampens our perception of the film and of Jiro's character. At least it does for me. Miyazaki would probably even agree, but I guess the guy just really likes planes. The company's even named after an Italian warplane. Despite their immediate effect on his family early on in his life, and their plane parts factory being a major source of his lifelong guilt, he's liked planes since he was a kid, saying, "I expressed my own desire for power by drawing airplanes with sleek and pointed noses, and battleships with huge guns. And I found myself thrilled by the bravery of sailors who, even as their burning ships sank, continued to fire their guns until the bitter end, by the men who plunged into the hail of fire and flak spewed forth by an enemy formation's guns. It was only much later that I realized that in reality, these men had desperately wanted to live and had been forced to die in vain." The Wind Rises was initially a manga series in hobby magazine Model Graphics in the early 2000s. Napier notes that, quote, "In page after page, carefully and intricately rendered images of war machines are front and center, occupying most of the manga. In general, rather than combat sequences, these manga seem to privilege military technology for its own sake, as complicated works of art that almost take on a life of their own. Interestingly, the engineers, including Jiro, are drawn as pigs, which might call back to Miyazaki's use of pigs as symbolic for curses.
Humanity has always dreamt of flight, but the dream is cursed.
Miyazaki wanted to portray the beauty of a craft and the dedication of a creator, but ultimately acknowledges it as a cursed dream, beautiful things distorted and exploited by a corrupt world. He admits the mournful truth that these aircraft are ultimately instruments of war. In an interview with a historian, he said he wanted to, quote, "take back the Zero Fighter from the hands of the military technology nuts and military fantasy novels, wanted to depict it as the doomed design it really was. It's the sad reality that a lot of major tech development is in some way related to war or the military-industrial complex. As remarked in a Verge article, The Wind Rises illustrates, quote, "the tragic near impossibility of combining dreams and reality."
どんなその時が善であると思ってやっても、やっぱり時代の風化の中で機械文明そのものの手先になるから無傷じゃないんですよ。呪われた夢なんです。アニメーションもそうです。
But along with this, The Wind Rises is also the story of a man more dedicated to his work than his family, a dilemma familiar to Miyazaki since he was a largely absent husband and father. In the film, Jiro loves his wife, but not as much as he loves airplanes. In parallel to Jiro's disappointment in the use of his creation, Miyazaki has also said that he has, quote, no pride or sense of accomplishment in his work. In its own way, filmmaking was Miyazaki's cursed dream. But perhaps even more significantly, the film allowed him to explore the moral contradictions of his father. Like I mentioned, Miyazaki harbored a lot of guilt because of his family's role in the war. He also seemed to be deeply impacted by an instance when his family was evacuating in a small truck and had to leave behind a woman and child who were asking for help. Quote, the voices saying, please let us on, got farther away, and it gradually took root in my head the way a traumatic event does. The fact that I had been raised comfortably in a family getting rich through munitions, at a time when most people were suffering materially, and that in the very midst of people dying, our family was able to escape in a truck where there was almost no gasoline to be had, and that we ended up abandoning people who were begging us to let them on. This is a memory that became a firm part of my 4-year-old self. Miyazaki rebelled against his father for much of his life, clinging to resentment that he says built up in him like sludge. They rarely saw eye to eye, and he didn't understand how his father could have contributed to such a senseless war. In the documentary, The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, he got a letter from a stranger extending gratitude towards his father, who treated them with a memorable moment of kindness during the war when they had nowhere to go. Miyazaki laughed about the moral inconsistency, fascinated by the fact that a man selling parts for bombers could turn around and be kind-hearted all the same.
一方で飛行機の部品作ってガバガバ稼いでたからこのね人生上の矛盾については
So much of his work seems to stress that duality of personhood, trying to reconcile how compassion and cruelty can simultaneously live within us. Producer Suzuki points out that most people, especially those with families to feed, wouldn't have gone against Japan's increasingly militaristic state at the time. At a later point in his life after his father died, Miyazaki felt he would approach a conversation with him differently if he had a chance to speak with his parents again, that he'd be better able to understand and sympathize with their perspective, acknowledging that the, quote, lower strata of society was mostly operating under a sense of realism that perhaps just couldn't be boiled down to militarism or nationalism, and that his father was doing all he could to protect his family. In 1995, he said, "If I have one regret, it's that I never discussed things seriously with my old man. From the time I was young, I always looked at him as a negative example, but it seems, after all, that I am like him. I've inherited my old man's anarchistic feelings, and his lack of concern about embracing contradictions."
けれど、父に腹を立てる気は起こりません。ただ、心に棘のように残っています。
Miyazaki likens filmmaking, or perhaps storytelling in general, to setting up a Christmas tree. You can put up a bunch of pretty glowing ornaments, i.e. art and cinematography, but the ornamental aspects are only part of a totality. You need a strong, solid trunk, a theme or larger purpose, with lots of branches to support the decor. But a film with just a message would be like a big, fat, dried-up log propped upright. All the components are necessary to create something worthwhile and memorable. I imagine his characters are the branches of the tree, and the needles the details of their experiences and motivations. I think this perspective is partially what helped him create a variety of female characters throughout his career, often unconventional ones that defy stereotypes, pigeonholing, or one-dimensionality. It seems he was ahead of his time in this regard, in a general sense, but especially in Japanese anime where over-sexualization of female characters, even underage ones, is extremely common. Miyazaki doesn't cater to fan service and typically doesn't even depict overt romance. In 2001, he said, "I felt this country only offered such things as crushes and romance to 10-year-old girls. In looking at my young friends, I felt this was not what they held dear in their hearts, not what they wanted, and so I wondered if I could make a movie in which they could be heroines. Rather than molding them into a one-note, stock, strong female character, what gives them agency is simply that they're active rather than passive, driving the plot forward through their own choices and development, with both strong moments and vulnerable moments, both commendable and questionable qualities, and being flawed and fallible. In other words, they're realistic. In Miyazaki's words, you need characters that are life-affirming and have clear hopes and goals." He may have been at least partially inspired to create these life-affirming heroines by 1958's The Tale of the White Serpent, the first color anime feature film, which ignited Miyazaki's desire to pursue animation as a career. But it seems his relationship with his mother was also a factor. Producer Suzuki has bluntly declared that Miyazaki was a mama's boy. Out of 4 sons, he was especially close to his mother, who was bedridden for much of his childhood. Sharp and strong-willed, she's said to have influenced many of the characters in his work, including the recurring references access to tuberculosis.
Because you're a girl, a female, that's man's work.
But you're female, Captain.
In particular, according to Napier, Dola from Castle in the Sky is widely considered to be an affectionate homage to Miyazaki's mother. Dola's meddlesomeness and flamboyance clearly accord with the Miyazaki children's memory of her. Miyazaki's younger brother Shiro wonders whether at some level Laputa was an awkward but ardent farewell present to their recently deceased mother. At the end of the movie, we see Dola and her strapping sons perching on their fleet of flying machines, offering the children a family to return to if they ever need one. I think Miyazaki's respect for his mother definitely influenced his ability to create these characters who feel so very real, while varying widely in age and demeanor. Nausicaa seemed to be the major starting point. A kind and loving person, but not as harmless and delicate as these kinds of nurturing characters tend to be. For example, she was still susceptible to rage, since she, killed a bunch of people. And this wasn't presented as an empowering moment, but something she expressed remorse for. And while it would have been easy to go with the trope of a sweet, nature-loving woman pitted against a power-hungry, aggressive man, the main antagonist was also a woman. Kushana, who was maimed in an insect attack, views the Ohm as the enemy and wants to fight to reclaim the Earth. But she's not a one-note villain. She seems reasonable in some instances and genuinely wants to talk things over. In this sense, she feels like a precursor to Lady Eboshi from Princess Mononoke, fighting against nature for what they believe is the greater good, for humanity's sake. And because creatures like the Ohm are easy to vilify in sci-fi, Kushana would be the hero in most stories like this. Through these kinds of characters, Miyazaki strengthens the notion that if you want to write interesting and fleshed out female characters, sometimes the best place to start is disregarding that label entirely. Like the character just happens to be a woman and it's not a big deal. That's not to say it should never matter. That identity is usually going to inform their experience and perception of the world in some capacity. Like Sophie from Howl's Moving Castle, who's a particularly interesting exploration of the stigma of aging, using a curse for direct contrasting between the social freedom allowed by age versus the constraints of youth. In the article Animating Grandma, Elizabeth Parsons writes that in Miyazaki's balancing act, old women can be powerful and weak, positive and negative, nurturing and selfish, maligned and loved. In short, they cannot be simply categorized or stereotyped, and they cannot be dismissed as fantasy malefactors embodied by evil witches.
That's right. I'm the scariest witch of them all.
Sophie was cursed with old age, and sure it came with its aches and pains, but on some level she was actually liberated by it. If anything, the doubts and uncertainty of youth was her real curse. She was plagued with insecurity because women are socialized to value physical appearance above all their other traits.
I've never once been beautiful in my entire life.
If self-assuredness took hold or she expressed herself openly, it diminished her curse. But habitual self-deprecation and low self-esteem let the spell take hold again.
Sophie, you're beautiful.
Only with her old appearance did she feel confident enough to speak her mind and do what was necessary to take care of herself. Miyazaki stresses, it would be a lie to say that turning young again would mean living happily ever after. I didn't want to say that. I didn't want to make it seem like turning old was such a bad thing. Sophie's transformed from a shy, mousy little girl into a blunt, honest woman. It's not a motif you see often, and, especially with an old woman taking up the whole screen, it's a big theatrical risk. But it's a delusion that being young means you're happy. In the book, Howl tells her she likes being in disguise, and though she gets upset, it's pretty true. The curse became a way to shelter herself from judgment of her true form. As an old lady, she could hide away peacefully, unbothered by people's standards of attractiveness, and instead focusing on what was actually important to her. She took pride in her new role in the castle, which was admittedly traditional, but that's not inherently a bad thing. It's a common and perhaps the oldest way in history to express love to those around you, which many can attest to if you have a mom or grandma who always asks if you're hungry and insists on feeding you regardless of the answer. Howl and Markle even follow suit in this expression of love and division of responsibilities, taking over the cooking and laundry, wanting to share in this role of caring for the household. In short, these everyday tasks are shown to be just as valuable as the magic Howl uses to transform their space, only Sophie did it without magic. Parsons writes, Sophie's real, rather than fantasy powers are those typically associated with the grandma she also calls herself. She transforms her world in two key ways, through loving nurture and through housework. On the surface, this logic is open to critique as a limited depiction of what women can do, and moreover, what older and no longer sexually desirable women are reduced to as representative of typical cultural patterns. That said, by refiguring these conventional grandma behaviors as powerful, magical, heroic, and successful, the film transcends transcends the problems associated with feminist bids to show women as empowered only if they succeed at traditionally masculine tasks. In the meantime, her character transcends ideals of beauty, and even welcomes the Witch of the Waste into her home, another old woman who used to suppress her age with magic due to insecurity but was forced to come to terms with it. Funnily enough, Howl is the main one who had to overcome his excessive vanity.
I see no point in living if I can't be beautiful.
It seems like he does based on his naturally black hair at the end. So by then, he and Sophie feel free and comfortable enough with themselves to live openly and unabashedly, in love with the true versions of each other, the beast no longer transformed. Overt romance is relatively rare in Miyazaki's films, but in Howl's Moving Castle, though Sophie has an elderly appearance for most of the movie, two men fell in love with her because of her heart rather than her outward appearance. She saves them both and manages to end the war in the process. The realization that her kind nature would always be more valuable than her looks is what transformed her confidence and spirit, with some help from her found family. Like I said, Miyazaki doesn't typically prioritize romance in his narratives, but when he does, he again wants to portray it as a part of life that should be life-affirming and sincere. He once said, "I've become skeptical of the unwritten rule that just because a boy and girl appear in the same feature, a romance must ensue. Rather, I want to portray a slightly different relationship. One where the two mutually inspire each other to live. If I'm able to, then perhaps I'll be closer to portraying a true expression of love." On that note, San and Ashitaka from Princess Mononoke portray a caring relationship on complicated terms. For much of the movie, she appears to represent Miyazaki's feelings of misanthropy, like Fujimoto and Ponyo.
Never! I hate all of you humans!
And along with the side of gentle and nurturing lover of nature like Nausicaa, she's often angry and murderous. It would have been easy to make her an unquestionable hero, champion of nature. But instead, just like her adversary Lady Eboshi, she sees the world with eyes clouded by hatred.
Look, everyone! This is what hatred looks like. This is what it does when it catches hold of you.
Raised by wolves, she's only ever interacted with other humans in the context of violent conflict. Meanwhile, Lady Eboshi operates with more hubris than evil. Like Kushana, she believes she's justified in her campaign against nature. Her affinity for outcasts appears to have solidified an us versus them mentality, and in her mind, the angry spirits wreaking havoc on her people are the same as the Emperor's samurai attacking and attempting to subjugate them. On the one hand, she employs and gives shelter to former sex workers, ex-crooks, and ostracized lepers. On the other, she's killing forest gods so she can expand her operation at the expense of the environment. She clearly feels she's doing the right thing and doesn't seem cruel just for cruelty's sake.
That brainless pig. I'm the one he should have put a curse on, not you.
Neil Gaiman, the English author who wrote the English screenplay for Princess Mononoke, said that in a meeting with Miramax, they were trying to press the issue of whether Lady Eboshi was a good or bad guy, whether the Shishigami was good or bad. He responded, "Miyazaki built a film in which there are no bad guys. There are only consequences. The black and white binary system of good and evil which dominates so many narratives, especially in children's media and especially Disney, sets a generally poor precedent for our perception of other people, who are almost never simply good or bad." Lady Eboshi represents the larger concept of modernity, and by extension the idea that modernity and tech advancement isn't inherently evil. It's just a means of humans trying to make life better for themselves that can sometimes get out of hand. As Napier writes, it illustrates the kind of moral compromises that being a leader or simply being human can force upon us. Both Eboshi and San seem to operate under the notion that only their own people matter and are worth living. And based on much of Miyazaki's work, he feels this is the crux of most human conflict. To touch on a film we haven't discussed yet, in Kiki's Delivery Service, Miyazaki places a witch in the modern age for a 1989 coming-of-age tale, which is pretty apt timing considering the 90s was rife with witch stories. In Pam Grossman's Waking the Witch, she writes that the teen witch is an avatar of the miseries, insecurities, and strange proclivities that so many of us keep knotted within as we navigate our young lives. Miyazaki seems to echo that sentiment, as he wanted a film centered on young girls navigating the uncertainty of youth, an expression of solidarity to young viewers who find themselves torn between dependence and independence. It also portrays the discord between tradition versus modernity, and how the former gradually gives way to the latter as young people start to make it in the world on their own.
I wish I had something pretty to wear. My dress is so ugly.
It tells the story of 13-year-old Kiki who leaves her home and family behind to spend a year alone as part of her witch's training. Since she can fly, she quickly finds work as a delivery girl, but burnout and self-doubt grate on her conscience. So she loses her magical abilities and has to overcome her insecurity and loss of passion. The entrepreneurial lifestyle is tough in general, but being 13 and working in a new, unfamiliar town, that's sure to make you lose a bit of your spark. Not only that, but she has to see other young people having fun, free to do as they please, while she has responsibilities to tend to.
She made a delivery to my house on my birthday. You mean she's working at her age?
Kiki's magic is tied to her inner spirit, so it comes as little surprise that she loses her abilities when she has to fly out of obligation rather than her own fulfillment. It purposefully parallels her new friend Ursula's lifestyle. Kiki develops a network of relationships within the town, mostly different kinds of women and girls in different phases of life. Her guidance from older women includes her mom and grandmother, the pregnant baker who houses and employs her, her first customer, the fashion designer, the older women she helps out, and of course Ursula, the artist.
That same spirit is what makes me paint, but we each need to find our own inspiration.
When Kiki loses her magic, she takes a break with her at her cabin in the forest. Ursula describes how her artistic creativity and Kiki's magic seem to operate in a similar way, and that when she loses her own creative juices, it just means it's time to take a step back.
Take long walks, look at the scenery, doze off at noon. Don't even think about flying.
Their friendship illustrates how important it is for young people, especially those on the verge of independence, to have role models to guide them. Miyazaki said that Ursula understands Kiki's anguish in an affirming way. I think these aspects are much more valuable to Kiki than whether her business will succeed, and she's helped by those around her even when she isn't aware of it. What's important for Kiki is not that her business succeeds, though of course that's no doubt important, but it's how she herself can become acquainted with many different people. Kiki takes Ursula's advice and tries not to dwell on her temporary shortcomings. By the end, when her friend Tombo needs help and Kiki reclaims her power, Miyazaki wanted to stress that she's not just gonna live happily ever after for all time. She'll still face setbacks, but she'll be capable of bouncing back from them. The fact she still can't speak to her cat Gigi anymore is another sign of her growing independence and self-reliance. Even still, her newfound community will always be there to affirm her path and help her along the way. In the end, she'll be okay.
Miyazaki's films have a tendency to take their time, which makes them thoroughly stand out as far as animation goes. You'll find some action sequences here and there, even though those are often subtle and measured, not requiring 1,000 cuts to play up intensity. But for the most part, the scenes are understated, leaving room to breathe and contemplate. This is probably a big reason of what people mean when they say Ghibli films are comforting or cozy. Some would say the slowed down momentum is just a filmmaking strategy rather than a theme, but I think it speaks to something larger than practical pacing or appealing cinematography. It conveys a vital message about life. Miyazaki feels children know best about living in the present, that for them, the present doesn't just exist for the sake of the future, so they're the best example of observing the wonder of ordinary life. He first started exploring the concept in the 1972 film Panda Go Panda. Directed by his longtime colleague Isao Takahata. It's about a girl with a found family, a papa and baby panda. In it, Miyazaki hoped to depict a vision of Japan as it could have been, and by extension how children could experience it. He said, at the time, it was thought that children liked flashy, noisy films, but we thought that fun and excitement are best found in the small moments of everyday life. We see this again in Ponyo. She marvels at running water, the function of a light bulb, the comfort of a fuzzy towel, a hot cup of milk and honey, and a bowl of lovingly prepared ramen. To Miyazaki, seeing the world through the eyes of small children lets us observe things anew again, so what we take for granted can instead be regarded with wonder, or at least gratitude. Appreciating mundane, simple pleasures is often a staple of slice-of-life type media, which is particularly popular in Japan. It underlines the poetic nature of day-to-day. Kiki learned this lesson of slowing down from Ursula. When life becomes too grating and filled with noise, remember to return to the simple joys that bring you peace. Miyazaki depicts rainy days, naps, sunsets, bicycle rides, meals with people you love, or even things like caring for the household with all the love and charm they deserve. Especially all the food. He may not necessarily be illustrating life exactly as it is, but he does show it as it feels. I don't know if food actually ever looks this good, but it definitely tastes this good. Animated works typically seem to be a vessel for dialogue or action that drives the plot forward. or for purposes of action or comedy. It's understandable, given that every movement a character makes, unlike live action, has to be meticulously planned and painfully deliberate, especially with time-consuming hand-drawn animation. Sasuke squeezing through a fence, Naoko folding clothes, or the way Chihiro puts her shoes on. Moments that Roger Ebert affectionately called gratuitous motion. These are pointless and time-consuming in the grand scheme of the plot, but help paint a realer picture of the world and of these characters. We discussed this in an old video, but it's a significant choice to have a largely silent scene with little to no action, often to convey emotional processing. Miyazaki described these moments as ma, or emptiness, denoted by the pauses between claps of his hands. He inserts this intentional emptiness to allow for breathing room, and to take a moment to build tension and impact so the film can grow into a wider dimension. There's moments like Lupin lounging on his car, Nausicaa meditating in the toxic forest, or Kiki waiting for customers in the bakery. Extended moments of nothingness with very few cuts. Children are seldom afforded these kinds of moments in media made for them. Miyazaki feels, if you have a constant tension at 80 degrees all the time, you just get numb. The people who make the movies are scared of silence, so they want to paper and plaster it over. They're worried that the audience will get bored. What my friends and I have been trying to do since the 1970s is to try and quiet things down a little bit. Don't just bombard them with noise and distraction, and to follow the path of children's emotions and feelings as we make a film. If you stay true to joy and astonishment and empathy, you don't have to have violence and you don't have to have action. They'll follow you.
子供のための映画というのは歌ったり踊ったり走ったりもう忙しくやらなければ子供はすぐ飽きてしまうという。私たちは30年かかってその考え方を打ち砕いてきたんです。
Instead of giving us anything to distract us from our own thoughts, we're forced to consider them as we wait with the characters. Like in perhaps the most famous scene out of Studio Ghibli, where Mei and Satsuki wait in the rain for their father's bus to arrive. Mei had already met Totoro, but her older sister was skeptical. As they stand in the dark near a shrine, Totoro casually appears next to them, and Satsuki offers him an umbrella. They wait together in silence, until Totoro is delighted by the sound of rain plopping. And then his bus arrives, followed by their father's bus soon after. On the surface, nothing huge really happens, though on a character level, it's Satsuki's bewildering introduction to Totoro and the end of her skepticism. And despite its uneventful nature, it's Miyazaki's most recognizable scene. There's yet another uneventful yet hugely impactful scene in 2001's Spirited Away. Spirited Away is another film that heavily features Kami, and Miyazaki likes to think of it as a descendant of Japanese folktales. In it, we follow the young, sullen Chihiro. While moving to a new city, she and her parents stumble upon what looks like an abandoned amusement park. After her parents are cursed, she's stuck working in a bathhouse that caters to spirits. Miyazaki lends to the ideal of simple pleasures and appreciating what we have by weaving anti-consumerism into the film's message. First, after eating piles of food at a seemingly empty restaurant, her parents were transformed into pigs. Second, Chihiro had to help clean a stink spirit who turned out to be a polluted river spirit. Its corruption reflects what mass consumption and materialism does to nature, and was directly inspired by Miyazaki's experience cleaning up a local river. And finally, after spending time in the bathhouse, the spirit No-Face became consumed with greed and excess, growing in size and impatience. Chihiro had treated him with kindness from the outset, so he repeatedly tried to win her affection with favors and gold.
No, I only need one. I don't want any, but thanks.
What would you like? Just name it.
He couldn't understand why she didn't operate the same way as everyone else in the bathhouse, why she didn't always want more than what she needed.
Take the gold. Take it.
Are you going to eat me?
Take it.
She hadn't conformed to the overindulgence and desperation for money, and not understanding this difference in her priorities, not being able to appeal to a shallow ideal as easily as he could have with everyone else, drove No-Face crazy.
Where is your home? Don't you have any friends or family?
No, I'm lonely.
In response, she fed him the dumpling given to her by the river spirit, and he promptly started regurgitating everything he'd consumed in his insatiable spree, cleansing himself of the bathhouse's influence. He followed her out to the train platform, where Miyazaki once again slows everything down to a silent scene, where Chihiro contemplates how much she's had to grow over the past few days. It's just a few characters sitting in a train, watching the world pass by outside the window. This train ride, where not much happens on the surface, is the emotional climax of the film. where Chihiro processes her feelings and experiences, a level of introspection it seems she never attained before. Miyazaki said, "Today's children feel shielded, protected, and distanced from reality, to the point where they only have a vague sense of what it means to be alive, where their only solution is to inflate their otherwise weak sense of self." Chihiro's skinny limbs and her deliberately miffed and apathetic expressions are a symbol of this. But as reality sets in, and as she directly confronts danger from which she cannot easily extricate herself, she demonstrates an adaptability and toughness that even she had not been aware of. She realizes that she has a life force in her that makes her capable of bold decisions and action. Everything led up to this point of maturation, of sitting still and legitimately thinking about her place in the world, realizing she was capable of more than she thought. It's a stark contrast to the Chihiro we saw early in the film, so absent-minded and unsure of herself. Like Kiki's Delivery Service, Spirited Away is a coming-of-age narrative where a young girl gains a sense of independence. And it all led up to this quiet, contemplative moment on a train. We sit with her there in that moment, and because there's nothing to make noise or distract us, we're thinking along with her. This kind of meditative pacing to achieve a certain emotional tone is a masterful feat in not just animation, but filmmaking in general. It's the same kind of atmosphere he tried to create in the Ghibli Museum, where cameras aren't allowed so guests can really pay attention and fully take everything in. And I'm sure the theme park opening later this year will be pretty similar, especially considering there won't be rides. Instead, like the characters in his films, people are encouraged to live in the present. In every avenue, Miyazaki prioritizes exploring and genuinely experiencing the world around you as it is, before the opportunity is lost.
Along with the silence and leisurely pacing, there's often a permeating sense of melancholy in Miyazaki's work, which I don't think can really be boiled down to simple nostalgia, though that's definitely a factor. Interestingly, he believes nostalgia isn't something you acquire when you grow up, but a fundamental part of our existence even from the time we're children, some kind of deep-seated yearning in the pit of our souls that never really goes away, the innate feeling of being incomplete in some way. And there are certain moments, however small, that have the capacity to stay with us for a lifetime. Moments of emotional potency that pictures or art will never fully be able to capture the way our memories do. He explained, "When people speak of a beautiful sunset, do they hurriedly rifle through a book of photographs of sunsets or go in search of a sunset? No, you speak about it by drawing on the many sunsets stored inside you, feelings deeply etched in the folds of your consciousness of the sunset you saw while carried on your mother's back so long ago that the memory is nearly a dream, or the sunset-washed landscape you saw when, for the first time in your life, you were enchanted by the scene around you, or the sunsets you witnessed that were wrapped in loneliness, anguish, or warmth. I sometimes think that there's something piled up in the human mind, something that's in our memory that we can't recall but haven't forgotten, or something buried even deeper, like the stones that make up a foundation. It might include things like our DNA, something at the extremities, something that we don't understand very well at all, something connected to something else that is completely mysterious." It seems he has been trying to recapture the intensity of those feelings and memories his entire career. The tagline for Totoro was, "We're returning to you something you've forgotten," though it's worth noting he said he didn't make it out of personal nostalgia, and that again, he was trying to encourage kids to play outside and use their bodies, minds, and imaginations. Still, the film's atmosphere gives off a sort of yearning for a simpler, more rural lifestyle of a different time, a phenomenon that's been dubbed eco-nostalgia by some scholars. The desire to return to a period when we were more in tune with nature and life didn't feel so complicated. Plus, there's the idea, often backed by research, that spending time in nature has positive health benefits. The fresh air, chirping birds, pretty views, and all that good stuff. In this way, My Neighbor Totoro can be thought of as a yashike, a subgenre of slice of life that portrays characters living in calming, peaceful, and healing environments. The scenery and characters in My Neighbor Totoro seem to have been influenced by Miyazaki's own childhood, including the girl's ailing mother. Like her, Miyazaki's mother was bedridden with tuberculosis for several years. And like Satsuki, Miyazaki had to pick up the slack around the house. Producer Suzuki once insisted that such a good kid like Satsuki couldn't exist, and Miyazaki angrily told him, "She did exist. That was me." So although Miyazaki denies it, it seems there's some merit to the idea that the film was influenced by personal nostalgia. Through the romanticization of the natural landscape, and because of his dislike of extensive urbanization, you can tell he misses this type of lifestyle. Many would dismiss his complaints as the rants of an old man, of the back-in-my-day variety. But there's at least some truth to what he says about how industrialization and the culture of instant gratification has altered our values and quality of life.
心配になることないですか、スタジオに。
スタジオの将来ははっきりしてますよ。やっていけなくなります。
The setting in My Neighbor Totoro instead provides a healing space, both enchanting and soothing. It's a break from the fast pace of modernization that most of us have grown so accustomed to. And even if you've never lived in a place like this, its appeal and tranquil energy comes across profoundly. So this sort of yearning isn't limited to people with actual nostalgic memories of a time like this. As described in the article Longing for the Absolute Satoyama, these are eco-nostalgic concepts glorifying a lost past, which many urban Japanese people might only have experienced in their early childhood, perhaps when visiting relatives in the countryside, but not as daily life. Historian Boyum employs the term pop nostalgia to name images of nostalgia popularized by those who have no or very limited experience of the past situation for which they long. Such an imagined nostalgia for rural Japan can be found in My Neighbor Totoro, which especially appeals to the urban audience and nurtures their feelings of loss, be they imaginary or real. Basically, they're suggesting the aesthetic visuals in the film are a hyper-real version of things. That it's not depicting this kind of lifestyle as it really is, but a romanticized and sentimental vision of a life that can actually be quite difficult. And it's true. Things are rarely as vibrant and beautiful and simple as they are in Ghibli films, but it still evokes the peaceful feelings we experience in the moments when things do feel bright and joyful. Napier writes, although the exceptional beauty of his imagery creates an other world of immense appeal, it's not an other world for its own sake, but a critical tool that finds the present world insufficient. It's been suggested this is why Mei and Satsuki needed Totoro in the first place, to transcend a painful reality, their sick mother, and inhabit a world where everything's calm, their acorns grow, and the dread is kept at bay for just a while. Things that don't make sense, including the unfairness of the world, can be accepted and taken in as part of the healing process.
それはもう目に見えてる。それ心配しててしょうがないです。どうにもならないです。
It seems this repeated attempt to capture this distant feeling has been a bittersweet venture for Miyazaki, and hanging on to hand-drawn animation appears to be another bid to cling to a fragment of the past, to not lose another piece of himself to modernization. But he recognizes the futility of viewing the past with rose-colored glasses. Quote, it's hard to strip the past of whatever sentimentalism and glamorization we've added to it. A memory that may have been the size of a single postage stamp at one point all of a sudden grows into a 5 feet by 4 feet tableau.
ジブリなんて困ってさ飛行機の名前で思いついてジブリとか言ったんだから。有名人だからね。綺麗だな。
For all the joy and beauty depicted in his films, and our corresponding feelings when watching them, their creator can't seem to grasp those very feelings for himself. It seems he's somehow trying to prove his worth through art, and always striving for something just out of reach, longing for something that can only exist now as a memory. And this sense of loss has only intensified as he's gotten older. In the afterword of Turning Point, in 2008, he wrote, "When you reach old age, a door creaks open. That door opened for me a few years ago. What I see through the door is not a straight road, but a hazy, gray world, as if heaven and earth had merged. When I turn around, I see a familiar alleyway, but I can't return there. The only thing I can do is to walk toward the gray world. Here and there I see the shadowy figures of my seniors who are walking slightly ahead of me, but it's not as if we build a sense of solidarity, and I must walk alone." So as far as his characters go, I still think the one that most mirrors Miyazaki is Marco, who first came to him as the image of a single pig flying alone. This is the vision he imagined when regarding himself, a cursed man coping with impermanence and piled-up disillusionment.
人間って生まれた途端に問題が起こるんですよ。
He repeatedly speaks of missing out on other possibilities of life, that by existing here, now, means losing out on the possibility of becoming countless other selves. And the world of animation represents the longing of those lost selves, and attempts to experience those lost possibilities. Though he feels we're trapped within these limitations and the morbid realities of the world, animation has offered him a modicum of hope, a chance to free ourselves from our complexes and tangled relationships, so we can live strong in a freer, more open world.
何かを選ぶってことは他のことで諦めることにつながるから結局そうなるんです。これはもうしょうがないです。人間の存在そのものはそういうものなんだから。
Miyazaki's art is impactful because although it evokes feelings of gratitude and joy, it's not as though he ignores the reality of suffering. Within its narratives, there's the gloomy knowledge that people have had these problems for hundreds of years, and we'll have to go on living repeating the same mistakes.
There are angry ghosts all around us. Dead from wars, sickness, starvation, and nobody cares.
In truth, he feels humanity is hopeless and irredeemable, and has no faith humans can control our egos enough for the change required. This is partly why he's developed a reputation as grumpy and pessimistic.
So you say you're under a curse? Well, so what? So's the whole damn world.
But he ultimately uses his art to try to battle against his natural pessimism. It's a life strategy embedded in him from the very beginning, from the moment he finished watching The Tale of the White Serpent. Quote, "It made me realize that behind a facade of cynical pronouncements, in actuality, I was really in love with the pure, earnest world of the film, even if it were only another cheap melodrama. I was no longer able to deny the fact that there was another me, a me that yearned desperately to affirm the world rather than negate it."
I shall shoot.
It seems he pursues this sort of affirmation most with ambivalent characters and scenarios. We've already touched on this a bit, but it's an aspect worth underscoring, as I think it's the most vital element in nearly every Miyazaki film. It seems to be the central tenet of his worldview, and showcases his confrontation of cynicism most clearly. In Western cinema, things are often clear-cut. There's a bad person doing bad things, and a good person, the protagonist, who we root for to stop them. Miyazaki paints a view of the world that's truer to life, one with bad circumstances, bad choices, bad reasoning, and very few genuinely bad people. More often than not, if there's even an antagonist at all, we can consider things from their point of view. Our perspective of them changes drastically by the end, or they even become a dear friend. He has a hard time depicting a purely evil person, because as he works on his projects for years, the characters become more real to him, so he imagines what their own lives and motivations might have been.
それから本当に心に穴が開いてしまった悪役を出すと映画全体が本当にすさんだものになりますから、それはやっぱり描きたくないんですね。
This pattern is even evident in his first feature film he directed, The Castle of Cagliostro, back in '79. Though the antagonist is pretty classically villainous, the main character Lupin was also originally kind of a jerk in the manga and anime series. He's the grandson of Maurice Leblanc's gentleman thief and master of disguise Arsène Lupin, and followed in his footsteps in occupation. Lupin is clever, conniving, and channels James Bond in his brand of violent adventures and promiscuity. Napier writes he was also the kind of overtly sexist man who might be booed off the screen these days. A man ruled largely by lust for money, women, and the thrill of the chase. Miyazaki and Takahata directed some of the series' episodes, but he had other plans for the film. He wanted Lupin to be more likable and sympathetic. In a fan club newsletter, he argued Lupin wouldn't be motivated for superficial reasons, but that in his soul swirls a rage towards the machinery of society that suffocates humanity, and he tries to bury the falseness of his heart through spurring himself to action. He's fighting to give his life meaning, and is yearning for someone who can lead him to that fight. Despite fans' protest, he fulfilled that plan, transforming Lupin into a character who'd grown up from his life of greed and debauchery into a somewhat more honorable and reflective man, showing that anyone can change. Another character that often gets overlooked is Jigo from Princess Mononoke, who at first seemed something like an ally, but later became a major antagonist. Miyazaki considers him the most common type of person in the world, an approachable person who fits their role well, and who typically operates on the basis of what's beneficial to them. Though he may feel conflicted about what he's doing and fully recognizes the questionable aspects, he'll shrug it off and continue, feeling he doesn't have much choice. Though his actions are frustrating and his reasoning is cowardly, Miyazaki said if we disowned this kind of person, we would have to disown almost all human beings.
I give up. Can't win against fools.
This is often the reality of what it means to be alive. It's not so much good or bad as just trying to survive. And Miyazaki insists we must survive, stressed over and over again in the recurring sentiment. We must continue to live.
You must live.
Even if to die in vain.
He's not dead, son. He's here right now, trying to tell us something, that it's time for both of us to live.
While visiting a leprosy sanatorium in the 90s, when patients were still forced into isolation, he learned something that became vital to his perspective on life, writing, "In the middle of no matter what kind of misery, there's joy and laughter. In human life, which tends towards ambiguity, I've never seen a place which shows this with such clarity."
The world is cursed, but still, you find reasons to keep living.
This is why this scene in particular speaks to Miyazaki's acknowledgement of life's difficulties, yet the insistence on embracing it and living it fully, a kind of optimistic nihilism. Rather than giving up, letting go, and allowing the misery and apathy to win out, you must remember the resilience of human beings throughout all the hard times in history. Know that an imperfect ending is all we may get, but the fact we got the story at all is also a gift. In his proposal for Princess Mononoke, he wrote, "The battle between rampaging forest gods and humanity cannot end well. There can be no happy ending. Yet even amid the hatred and slaughter, there are things worthy of life. It is possible for wonderful encounters to occur and for beautiful things to exist. I would depict hatred, but only to show that there's something more valuable. I would depict a curse to show the joy of liberation from it. I would depict the boy's understanding of the girl and the process by which the girl opens her heart to the boy. In the end, the girl will likely say to the boy, "I love you, Ashitaka, but I cannot forgive humanity." Smiling, the boy will probably say, "That's alright, let's live together in peace."
It's clear Miyazaki sprinkles himself, his own bundle of contradictions, and all of our contradictions, into nearly every character he creates. He seeks to amplify the good parts, and still wants to acknowledge the not so good, because it's real. Living with that balance is something we all have to do, and still there are things worth striving for, worth living for. The contradictions, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, apply not just to him, but to us all. And it's a major reason why he's managed to perfect the art of connecting and impacting us on a wholehearted and profound level. This last quote was about Kiki's delivery service, but I think it applies to all of his work. Quote, "Basically, I think I just want children to know that the world is deep and filled with variety, that there are infinite possibilities in the world they live in, and that they are a part of this world. Perhaps it's enough just to say that the world is rich and precious and that they hold it in their hands. I honestly made this film just wanting to tell them, don't worry, you can make it all right." There's yet another Miyazaki-directed film set to come out next year, titled How Do You Live?, based on the 1937 novel of the same name. If the title's any indication, it'll have a similar sentiment to his other work. According to a longtime Ghibli colleague, the 2016 TV documentary called Never Ending Man would have been better translated to The Man Who Was Never Finished. Even at the age of 81, he can't help but throw himself into his craft. Producer Suzuki said Miyazaki's creating the film for his grandson, as a way of saying Grandpa's moving on to the next world soon, but he's leaving behind this film for you. It's fitting considering the last sentiment he expressed in Turning Point was that children are the spirit of hope for a better future, though maybe the film will be his farewell to everyone. It's bittersweet but moving that a cynical, grumpy old man has dedicated his life to inspire young generations to have more hope and optimism for the world than he ever did. And we hope his masterpieces will continue to inspire and uplift people for generations to come. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Can't believe we made it to 100K. That's freaking crazy.
Bananas.
If you like our videos, consider supporting the channel for just $2 on Patreon.
It's only like the cost of a candy bar a month.
And of course, supporting and appreciating great films is pretty important to us, so we want to thank Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service, a place to watch beautiful, interesting, and credible cinema. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there is always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. Mubi was honestly the perfect sponsor for this video because I think it's kind of easy to get trapped in like a limited idea of what movies are supposed to be like. You're always going to find filmmakers on there who are really thinking outside the conventions of the craft and making art that's really memorable and thought-provoking.
I really enjoy the international films on Mubi. It shows a different perspective on how to make films in a film language that's very unique and just different from what we're used to.
And you can even sort by country, so you can like look at specific places and see how maybe they approach filmmaking. I feel like it really expands your horizons. Like I recently checked out this 70s Hungarian animated film called Bubble Bath, which was super cool and surreal. But I'm also enjoying the subdued pacing in Japanese films like I Wish. If you want to try out Mubi's unique catalog, you can try it free for 30 days at mubi.com/qualityculture. That's mubi.com/qualityculture for a whole month of great cinema for free. But again, we're always just so thankful to you guys for watching and showing us love all the time.
Yes, it means so much to us, and I've given you my voice, so please love this video. We gave it everything we got.
But yeah, hope y'all have a great day, month, rest of your year. We'll catch you guys next time.
Peace.
Bye.